As the king and queen leave the thrones and head for the exit of Westminster Abbey of the coronation ceremony, you'll see that everyone bows and curtsies to the king, and no one moves a limb, a muscle, when Camilla passes.
King Charles had entered the private morning briefing, expecting routine papers and a controlled day inside the monarchy. Instead, a sealed court order was placed before him. Within moments, the sovereign learned that Queen Camilla had been legally ordered to surrender the Queen Mother's hidden ruby set, a collection kept beyond the royal collection for years. Charles read the ruling twice, then he stopped speaking. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles removed his glasses and placed them beside the judgment, as though movement might make the words real. The order was binding. That meant the decision carried the force of law and could not be ignored or softened by palace influence. The ruby necklace, matching earrings, bracelet, and ceremonial brooch had to be returned to the royal collection. The body responsible for preserving objects held for the monarchy rather than any individual royal. The king stared at the final paragraph while silence tightened around his study at Clarence House. The ruling followed an ownership dispute brought by royal estate trustees, officials required to protect property left to the crown. They argued that the rubies were never a private gift, never Camilla's inheritance, and never hers to keep behind a locked door. Camilla entered expecting a routine exchange and stopped when she saw his face. She moved toward him, but the monarch did not rise. When he said the court had ruled against her, the queen consort gripped the back of a chair until her fingers whitened. She refused to sit. She refused to touch the document. For several seconds, she could not decide whether she felt betrayed, exposed, or afraid. Charles forced himself to continue. The set had to be surrendered within 48 hours, under independent supervision, meaning outside witnesses would inspect, record, and receive every piece. The palace could not arrange a transfer. It could not control the timing. It could not hide the humiliation. Then the king reached the detail that had shaken him most. A handwritten inventory inside the Queen Mother's jewelry ledger described the rubies as an heirloom reserved for future queens, not as a personal gift. The ledger was a formal record of royal possessions, and its wording turned sentiment into evidence. Camilla finally looked at him. Charles lowered the page and asked the question neither could escape: who had placed the ruby set inside her private collection in the first place? But before he could understand how the court had reached its decision, he had to confront what those jewels meant to her, and why she had fought so fiercely to keep them. To the outside world, the case concerned gemstones, inventories, and royal ownership. Inside the marriage, it concerned something far more dangerous: belonging. For Camilla, the ruby set had become proof that she had finally been accepted by a dynasty that once kept her at a distance. For Charles, those jewels carried his grandmother's memory and the fragile authority of the crown. The court had not simply ordered an heirloom returned. It had opened a wound between husband and wife. Camilla sat alone before the locked ruby case, her fingertips resting against the lid without lifting it. The Queen Mother had once stood at the emotional center of the royal family, and her approval had carried enormous weight. To possess something so closely tied to her legacy had made the queen consort feel that years of public rejection were finally behind her. Surrendering it now would not feel like returning property. It would feel like being told she had never truly belonged. Charles entered without aids and closed the door quietly. The king knew his grandmother had treated royal possessions as responsibilities, not rewards. Her discipline had shaped his belief that the monarchy survived only when private desire gave way to public duty. Yet he also understood what the rubies meant to his wife, and that knowledge made every word harder. Camilla did not look at him when he said resisting the judgment would damage both the crown and their marriage. The crown meant the institution, its laws, traditions, and public trust, not simply the person wearing it. She finally turned and told him surrender would make her appear like an intruder, caught holding something that had never been hers. Her voice stayed controlled, but humiliation sharpened every sentence. Charles moved closer, but she pulled her hand away from the case. He reminded her that the court had already decided ownership. She answered that courts could decide property, but they could not decide what years of loyalty had cost her. The monarch heard the accusation beneath her words. He had allowed her to believe the rubies were safe, then stood silent when that belief collapsed. William's name entered the room like a threat. Months earlier, the prince had warned his father during a private recorded conversation that unanswered questions surrounding historic jewels could become a legal and constitutional crisis. Constitutional meant connected to the rules controlling how the monarchy must act. He believed royal property had to be protected consistently, even when the person involved was close to the sovereign. Camilla stared at Charles and accused the future king of helping the estate trustees build the case against her. She demanded a denial. The king looked toward the locked ruby case, then back at his wife. But he did not answer quickly enough. That silence changed everything, because her suspicion had begun months earlier, when one unmistakable incident transformed an old family disagreement into a confrontation that could no longer remain hidden. The crisis could be traced to one precise evening, the Commonwealth reception at Windsor Castle. When Camilla entered the state drawing room, wearing a ruby brooch, senior staff recognized immediately. It had not appeared publicly since the Queen Mother's final years. The reception continued. Glasses rose and polite conversations carried on. But one retired royal curator froze. Before midnight, a confidential question had reached the estate trustees. The Queen Mother had worn that central ruby at major wartime commemorations, where it became tied to endurance, memory, and royal service. Years later, she placed the complete set inside a numbered heirloom case, a secured container used for jewels, intended to remain within the monarchy across generations. That history mattered, because the brooch was never treated as an ordinary ornament. It belonged to a collection carrying both public meaning and strict ownership records. William noticed the curator staring before anyone else did. The prince followed the older man's gaze and saw the ruby fixed against Camilla's formal dress. She moved through the room with calm confidence, unaware that the jewel had already unsettled someone who knew its history better than most living courtiers. The future king waited until the reception ended before approaching him privately. The curator spoke in a documented account prepared later for the trustees and said the brooch should still have been sealed with the Queen Mother's estate. Estate trustees were the officials responsible for protecting property left under formal inheritance instructions. According to the former keeper, no approved transfer had ever crossed his desk. Camilla confronted Charles later in a quiet corridor, after learning questions had been raised. The Queen Consort insisted the piece had been given to her years earlier, through an informal family understanding. She said the arrangement had been known inside the household, and never challenged. The king asked for a gift letter, personal note, or signed instruction. She had none. Charles felt the ground shift beneath him. After his grandmother's death, the complete ruby set had vanished from the working royal collection inventory, the active list used to track jewels held for official royal use. No bequest named Camilla. No transfer record placed the set in her private ownership. Still, the monarch wanted to believe a simple explanation remained. The security logs destroyed that hope. A documented review showed that a red jewelry case had been removed from royal storage under the authorization code of a senior courtier who had since died. At first, the record seemed to support Camilla's account. Then, experts compared the approval signature with verified letters written by the same man. The handwriting did not match. Charles read the finding in silence, while Camilla stood across from him, waiting for reassurance he could no longer give. William had seen the same report, and the prince understood immediately what it meant. The dispute was no longer about memory, misunderstanding, or family custom. Someone had used a dead courtier's authority to remove the jewels improperly. Once Charles learned the signature could not be authenticated, the issue stopped being a quiet disagreement over inheritance, and became a face-to-face reckoning between the three people with the most to lose. The confrontation came without secretaries, legal advisors, or carefully prepared palace language. Charles summoned Camilla and William to a private sitting room and closed the door himself. On the table lay the disputed inventory, the questionable authorization, and a photograph of the ruby brooch at Windsor. The king demanded the truth. What followed was not a constitutional discussion. It was a family argument years in the making. Charles placed the copied authorization between them and asked Camilla whether she had known the ruby set was never formally transferred into her personal ownership. A formal transfer meant a written, legally recognized change of possession rather than an unwritten family arrangement. The monarch kept his voice controlled, but every word carried the force of betrayal. He was no longer asking what she believed. He was asking what she knew. Camilla refused to retreat. The queen consort insisted the red case had reached her with the sovereign's knowledge years earlier, through one of the private understandings that had long shaped palace life. She argued that royal households often operated through trust, spoken permission, and inherited custom. To her, the absence of paperwork did not erase the promise she believed had been made. William chose his words carefully. The prince said an informal understanding could not override the Queen Mother's inventory, the official record identifying who controlled the jewels after her death. He spoke without raising his voice, but Camilla heard judgment in every sentence. She accused the future king of treating her like a temporary occupant, tolerated beside Charles but never fully accepted by the dynasty. Charles reacted sharply. The king warned both of them that the monarchy could not survive if personal resentment controlled decisions about crown property, objects held for the institution rather than for private enjoyment. Camilla turned toward him and asked whether he truly believed resentment belonged only to her. William stiffened, but he did not answer the accusation. Camilla reached for the ruby brooch fastened against her clothing. She removed it, placed it hard against the table, and told Charles he had to decide whether she was his queen or merely a custodian waiting to be replaced. The sound cut through the room. The monarch stared at the jewel while she waited for him to choose love over law. William finally revealed the source through a documented account submitted to the trustees. The retired curator had raised the original concern independently after the Windsor reception. The prince had not started the legal action, and the future king had not supplied the false signature. The trustees moved only after experts confirmed the authorization did not match the dead courtier's verified handwriting. Camilla looked at Charles and demanded that he suppress the case before it reached the court. He refused. She left without taking the brooch. The door closed behind her, leaving father and son facing each other across the table, while the ruby remained between them, like an accusation neither could escape. Yet the most consequential decision was no longer Charles's to make, because the evidence had already passed into the hands of authorities loyal not to his marriage, but to the legal continuity of the crown. For generations, royal disputes had been softened by discretion, delayed by protocol, or buried behind palace walls. This time, the machinery refused to bend. The estate trustees had one duty: protect assets assigned to the monarchy rather than to any individual member of the family. When Charles privately asked whether the surrender could be postponed, the senior trustee closed the file and gave an answer few people had ever dared deliver to a reigning sovereign: no. Charles sat across from him in a small library and felt the words settle with brutal force. The senior trustee explained that the sovereign's personal possessions belonged to the individual monarch, while crown heirlooms were held for the institution and passed forward under strict rules. That distinction meant the king could not simply gift the ruby set to Camilla, rename it as private property, or erase the Queen Mother's instructions. The monarch listened without interruption as the legal position became clearer. The trustees drew their authority from the Queen Mother's estate settlement. the formal document governing how her property had to be handled after her death. Any item removed without valid written approval had to be recovered. Charles's title gave him influence, ceremony, and public authority, but it could not rewrite that settlement. Charles asked whether the return could happen privately. The king wanted to spare his wife the sight of strangers inspecting jewels she had treated as symbols of acceptance. He also feared that a public handover would turn a legal correction into a personal humiliation. The senior trustee shook his head. The court order required independent witnesses, a written inventory, and a documented transfer. Secrecy was no longer possible. The trustee then opened a second file. The court had examined 3 pieces of evidence: the original jewelry inventory, the storage records, and a private letter preserved in the estate archive. In that letter, the Queen Mother described the rubies as belonging to the line of queens who follow. The documented account gave the phrase legal weight because it showed her intention clearly. The jewels were meant to serve the crown across generations, not remain with one person. Catherine's name entered the conversation carefully. As a future queen, she could one day be permitted to wear the set during official duty. That possibility mattered, because Camilla feared the return would be seen not merely as compliance, but as a symbolic transfer of legitimacy from her to the Princess of Wales. What the court viewed as property, the family would read as power. Charles lowered his eyes when the trustee gave him the final schedule. The handover would take place at 10 o'clock the following morning. Independent officers would arrive before the deadline, and every piece would be checked in his wife's presence. The king left with less than a day to persuade Camilla to comply peacefully. When he returned to Clarence's house with the deadline in his hand, he discovered the ruling had already begun changing everyone around him, and the queen consort had made a decision of her own. The palace had hoped for silence, but silence became impossible when staff were ordered to prepare the ruby case for supervised removal. Locks were checked. Inventory sheets were printed. A neutral jeweler was summoned. Every practical step made the judgment feel more real. Camilla watched strangers measure, photograph, and catalog the pieces she had considered hers. By evening, the queen was no longer fighting over ownership. She was fighting to preserve her dignity. Camilla stood rigid as familiar servants entered her private dressing room under formal instruction. The order required them to treat the ruby set as disputed property, rather than part of her personal collection. That distinction mattered because every piece now had to be protected for the monarchy, not handled according to her wishes. Staff, who had once helped her choose jewels for public duties, now avoided her eyes while preparing them for removal. The independent jeweler opened the case and began matching each item against archival photographs, older images used to confirm identity, condition, and missing details. The necklace was inspected first, followed by the earrings and ceremonial brooch. Each clasp, stone, and setting had to be recorded before the collection could enter secure royal collection storage. Any unexplained damage or missing item could delay the transfer and deepen the legal crisis. Camilla remained silent until the jeweler asked her to remove the ruby bracelet herself. The queen consort reached for the clasp, but her hands trembled. She tried once, then again. Charles watched from the doorway, torn between stepping forward as her husband and remaining still as the king responsible for obeying the judgment. When the bracelet finally came free, she held it out without speaking. Charles took one step toward her, but Camilla turned away. The monarch understood that comfort might feel like pity, and pity was the one thing she could not bear. She had entered the royal family after years of resistance, and believed the rubies proved she had survived that rejection. Now the same jewels were being counted in front of her like evidence. The jeweler suddenly stopped. A smaller ceremonial ruby pin listed in the Queen Mother's inventory was not inside the case. The missing piece threatened to make the surrender incomplete, raising the possibility of further investigation. Camilla looked at Charles in disbelief. The king knew immediately that the absence could be interpreted as concealment. even if she had never possessed it. William received the next discovery through a recorded conversation recovered from the deceased courtier's archived files. In the recording, the man explained that the pin had been separated from the set before the red case reached Camilla. He mentioned placing it inside a memorial box connected to Charles's private inheritance. The prince called his father at once. The king listened without interruption, then looked toward the room where his grandmother's personal keepsakes had remained untouched for years. The final ruby might have been in his possession all along. The search for that missing pin would produce the decisive change, not in a courtroom or council chamber, but in a private conversation between a father and son, stripped of every royal protection. Long after the staff had withdrawn, Charles opened the memorial box alone. Beneath old photographs, handwritten notes, and a faded ribbon from his childhood lay a small velvet pouch he had not touched in years. Inside was the missing ruby pin. The discovery cleared Camilla of concealing the final piece, but it also forced the king to accept that confusion inside his own household had allowed the dispute to become a public wound. Charles held the pin in silence and understood immediately what it proved. The disputed set had been divided after the Queen Mother's death without a complete written record. Yet the discovery did not overturn the judgment because every component remained part of the crown heirloom collection, meaning jewels preserved for the monarchy across generations rather than owned by one individual. Camilla had not hidden the final piece, but she still had to return the rest. William entered without aids and closed the door behind him. The prince saw the open box, the velvet pouch, and the ruby resting in his father's hand. Charles placed the pin between them and admitted what he had resisted saying for months. His desire to protect his wife had made him dismiss warning signs, question uncomfortable evidence, and hope private loyalty could solve a legal problem. William did not celebrate. The future king told his father that he had never wanted his stepmother humiliated. He wanted rules strong enough to protect everyone equally, because rules that changed for one person would eventually protect no one. The prince's restraint unsettled Charles more than anger would have. There was no victory in the room, only the cost of waiting too long to face the truth. Charles confessed his deepest fear. The king believed surrendering the jewels would make Camilla think he had chosen the institution over their marriage. William answered quietly that standing beside her during the handover would prove the opposite. Obeying the court did not require abandoning his wife. Hiding behind officials would. The monarch reached back into the memorial box and found a folded handwritten note beneath the pouch. A documented comparison confirmed the Queen Mother's handwriting. Her words instructed that the rubies should unite future generations rather than become personal trophies. The message stripped away the final excuse. The collection had never been intended as proof of one woman's victory over another. Charles carried the pin to Camilla himself. The queen consort looked at it, then at him, and understood that the missing piece had been found among his inheritance. He told her she had not concealed it. Then he asked her to enter the handover room beside him. Camilla hesitated before agreeing. The surrender would still hurt, but it would no longer be performed as punishment. Husband and wife would return the jewels together, accepting responsibility without allowing humiliation to define them. That choice changed the meaning of the morning. But outside the palace gates, the judgment had already become a national spectacle, captured in one unforgettable image. By sunrise, the private pain of 3 people had become a national event. Broadcasters filled their screens with images of the Queen Mother wearing the rubies decades earlier. Commentators argued over property, privilege, and royal duty. Then, shortly before 10, a dark vehicle entered the gates, carrying Charles, Camilla, and the sealed red case. One photograph, her hand resting beside his, neither of them smiling, captured the entire story before a single statement was issued. The palace released a brief statement confirming that the court order had been fully respected, and the ruby collection was being restored to official custody. Official custody meant secure control by the royal collection, rather than private possession by one family member. The wording was calm, but its meaning was severe. The monarchy had admitted that the jewels were never Camilla's to keep, and the admission could not be hidden behind ceremony. William watched the live broadcast privately with Catherine. The prince felt relief that the handover was proceeding without resistance, yet the future king could not ignore the humiliation surrounding his father and stepmother. Catherine saw the strain in his face and reminded him that accountability without mercy could easily become cruelty. He said nothing, but he did not turn away from the screen. Outside Buckingham Palace, the public mood became impossible to contain. A crowd gathered beneath the balcony, while a newspaper seller lifted a front page above his head. Rubies returned, stretched across the paper, beneath an image of the sealed case entering royal custody. That single headline turned a private legal dispute into a national verdict. A leading broadcaster described the handover as the moment the monarchy proved that even its most senior members remained accountable to the rules governing historic property. The phrase mattered because the crown depends on public trust. If Charles had protected Camilla from the judgment, every future promise of fairness would have sounded empty. Camilla entered the handover room beside her husband and signed the inventory slowly. The queen consort paused over the final page, then slid the pen toward Charles. The king signed as witness before opening his hand and placing the missing ruby pin beside the necklace. The gesture completed the collection and ended any suspicion that his wife had concealed the final piece. Catherine then made a private request through a documented message sent to the trustees. The Princess of Wales asked that the rubies remain unworn for a period of remembrance. She did not want the return to look like an immediate transfer of victory from Camilla to a future queen. Camilla heard about the request before leaving. She had expected triumph, perhaps even quiet satisfaction. Instead, she found restraint. For the first time since the court order arrived, the queen understood that Catherine had chosen dignity over advantage. With the court obeyed, the jewels secured, and the public judgment already written, only one verdict remained: the private meaning of what Charles, Camilla, and William had lost and recovered. The ruby set returned to the royal collection exactly as the court commanded. But the true resolution did not happen inside the secure vault. It came later, in a private room where Camilla removed the empty jewelry case from her table and Charles sat beside her without defending himself. The queen had lost possession of the rubies. The king had lost the illusion that love could excuse uncertainty. Yet neither had to lose the family. Every piece of the Queen Mother's collection was formally verified, sealed, and restored, including the missing ceremonial pin. The royal collection, the body responsible for preserving historic objects held for the monarchy, confirmed that nothing remained unaccounted for. That mattered because the case had threatened more than reputation. It had raised the fear that private loyalty could override the rules protecting royal property. The court closed the recovery action after full compliance and imposed no further sanction. The incomplete records explained how the confusion had developed, while the intact return proved that the jewels had not been damaged or permanently concealed. Camilla escaped further legal punishment, but the emotional cost could not be erased by a closing document. Charles apologized without excuses. The king admitted that he had allowed private understandings to remain undocumented because he wanted to protect his wife from another rejection. Camilla answered with equal honesty. She had held on to the ruby set because it made her feel accepted by a family whose approval she had spent years trying to earn. The queen consort did not call the jewels hers again. She simply admitted why losing them had hurt so deeply. William met her privately soon afterward. The prince told Camilla that the case had never been intended to erase her place beside his father. He had wanted the same rules to protect every generation, including hers. She offered no immediate warmth, but she accepted his words without accusation. For the first time, the future king and his stepmother spoke without turning the rubies into a weapon. A final decision gave the surrender its lasting meaning. The collection would remain unworn until a future state commemoration honoring the Queen Mother. A state commemoration is an official national ceremony held to remember a major royal figure or historic moment. When the rubies appeared again, they would represent service to the crown, not victory for one woman over another. Charles's stunned reaction had marked the moment he finally understood the truth. A modern monarchy survives not by hiding painful mistakes, but by accepting limits, even when those limits enter the sovereign's own marriage. Camilla's surrender did not remove her from the family. Her choice to comply, his choice to stand beside her, and William's refusal to celebrate transformed humiliation into duty and resentment into mercy. The rubies returned to the crown, but the greater restoration occurred within the family. Authority was respected, resentment was restrained, and a monarchy shaken by secrecy emerged steadier because, at the decisive moment, duty was finally placed above possession. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.